believe that you are solely one person. It makes sense, right? You have one brain, one heart, one body.
But do you have one absolute identity? Or do you say have different personalities depending on who you were around at the time?
Are you different around your parents than you are your friends? I hope the answer to that question is yes.
All of these questions lead us to one concept, the Boysian double consciousness, a theory that says that your identity is broken into several parts that potentially conflict with one another. In order to expose the atrocity of the slave system, Frederick Douglass presents anecdotal evidence which aligns with the concept of Du Boisian double consciousness.
When describing both masters and slaves, Douglass introduces the idea of multiple identities within an individual, primarily as a result of the backwards nature of slavery.
While slaves strive to find the perfect balance between man and animal, masters strive to be both rulers of their captives and followers of the Christian faith.
In order to further explain this idea and its significance, let's go straight into the thought bubble.
W.E.B. Du Bois was an African-American sociologist, historian, and civil rights activist of the early 1900s. He first introduces the idea of Du Boisian double consciousness in his publication of The Souls of Black Folk in 1903. He defines double consciousness as the individual sensation of feeling as though your identity is divided into several parts, making it difficult or impossible to have one unified identity. He argued that double consciousness forces African Americans to not only view themselves from their own unique perspective, but also consider how they are being perceived by their outside world. Frederick Douglass demonstrates this inner conflict with anecdotal evidence of the slave system he endured. Describing the singing of fellow slaves, Douglass says, "They would sing in the most pathetic sentiment, in the most rapturous tone. The act of singing with spirit demonstrated the human qualities of the slave, but the wretched beliefs in which they sung with a blissful spirit indicated a lack thereof that clashed with the former." When the worth of slaves comes into question, Douglass even goes as far to compare the ranking of slaves to that of farm animals. In doing so, the clashing identities of the slaves is emphasized. Douglass and fellow slaves know that they are human, but because they are treated as animals, a split in identity occurs as they scramble to fulfill two positions that altogether contradict one another.
From the beliefs expressed in Douglass's memoir, we can presume that he saw personhood as an attribute that can be both gained and lost. Mrs. Auld was a former slave master of his that was presented in a chapter. When she was first presented, she was seen as a principled and righteous person. But a mere chapter later, she was presented as a diametric opposite of herself. This is due to her participating in the act of slavery. Her participation made her lose the moral qualifications that allowed Douglass to see her as a person.
While Mrs. Auld lost her personhood, Douglass swiped his from the hands of slavery through his gaining of knowledge. When Douglass gained the ability to read, he also furthered his personhood, seeing that knowledge as well as self-autonomy are some of the most vital qualifications in determining one's personhood.
The denial of these vital qualifications to slaves by their masters demonstrates that personhood can be decided by one's circumstances. Slaves were deprived of basic rights such as the ability to read, the knowledge of their age, and even the privilege of naming their own children. In this sense, slaves were cheated out of their personhood by those holding them captive.
Frederick Douglass executes his interpretation of African American life in American society as a whole during the 19th and 20th century.
His expression of the slave system highlights his interpretation of Du Boisian double consciousness and what constitutes one's person.
These signify the ability